Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. This is our last lecture, yay! This one is on assessment and ethics. So when we talked about the purpose of testing, the whole purpose of testing has to deal with being able to measure how much students understood about the material that was covered that year, that there was a change in how well they did in previous years to this year. They have been administered a test under standardized conditions, so everybody has had the same opportunity. We need valid and reliable test results because we want to make sure that when we try to identify levels where students may need improvement or where students have actually demonstrated mastery, that information is true. Also, in a larger sense, administrators, principals, board members, superintendents, etc., will be looking to see how effective the programs that they've implemented, whether it's curricular programs or it's some sort of like pull-out program, is being used and is being actually effective in the school system. And they also use this information to be able to compare students against one another and also against local schools and also throughout the United States. If you recall, during the Obama administration, his Secretary of Education was a man named Arne Duncan. And in 2011, there was sort of this widespread cheating that started to be associated with the Common Core state standards. Now, I want to make things clear. Cheating for high stakes exams had been happening for a really long time. But this is one of the first times that the country started to catch wind of it nationally. It was another reason to kind of look at the standardized testing and the Common Core and the move towards Common Core state testing that was the same with various consortiums throughout the United States, and questioning teachers, administrators on how ethical they're being with the exams became a huge talking point. I'm going to leave this up here for you guys to read, but one point I will bring up is that I like the last sentence where it says, instead, cheating reflects a willingness to lie at children's expense to avoid accountability, an approach I reject entirely. So, like I said, it's not only common. Like social promotion, cheating has helped students pass a high-stake exam and the hopes that those that would struggle with these exams would move to the next level of school or to graduate, but it will eventually hurt them with more difficult material later on. As the United States started to look at these like widespread anomalies with things like the regions, with state testing, with even scandals that we're seeing now with the SAT and the ACT, the idea of being more vigilant towards the people that are the keepers of these exams became more important. Just to give you some instances of cheating that has made the news, and you can see that this is as recent as 2019, and I have an example that went all the way back to 1987. Sometimes when we get to this lecture, this last lecture, perhaps our mind might be towards the idea of students cheating on a test. But teachers cheating on a test happens a lot. It's recently making the news more and more often, or at least the reporting on it more and more often now. The ramifications certainly will destroy a career, but in some instances, people have taken their life over this. If you look back, and like I said, all these are live links. If you look back and to just as recently as 2015, principal of like a school at Teachers College in Morningside had jumped inside of a subway because they had been accused of tampering with standardized tests and they couldn't deal with the ramifications. Anybody that would compromise the validity and reliability of those tests and make it appear as though the students did better or worse than they actually fared on their own is problematic. And we're going to talk about what to do in these situations. So, what makes a practice ethical? So for standardized tests, you want everything to be fair and equal. Problematic practices are anything that's going to give one student an unfair advantage or disadvantage and affect the validity of the score. Ethical testing is really going to just come out to ethical teaching. Establishing a healthy testing culture within your class. So tests are just part of learning. They're not meant to be evaluative. Nobody's passing judgment. It's just an exam that will give us indications of how well a student fares. Having multiple measures also adds to a healthy testing culture because an actual test doesn't necessarily weigh as much as or when a teacher has projects and papers and different types of scores that will also be reflected in the student's final mark. Another thing is we want to make sure that students are enrolled in the appropriate course so they can receive appropriate instruction. We looked at that in the validity lecture, where we looked at how much are you going to weigh a test score into placing students into various types of programs, or how much are you going to weigh the standardized tests. That should be one piece of information. It shouldn't be everything. So you want to make sure that you're bringing in various types of information to make sure that students are enrolled in appropriate courses. As you're teaching, make sure that you understand the intended depth and breadth of the course curriculum. The only way you're going to know if you are doing so is by communication with your colleagues, doing research, looking to see what other schools say, going to professional developments. The Common Core is written in a very superficial way. They wrote it that way intentionally so it wouldn't just be a checklist, and they were also trying to distinguish which teachers had knowledge of pedagogy and curriculum versus which teachers did not. So really going in and making sure that you're fully understanding the depth and breadth of the Common Core or whatever blueprint or standards you use for your school is very important. If students are entitled to accommodations, then make sure that they're identified ahead of time, and those accommodations should be part of the regular testing practice. It shouldn't just happen for the standardized tests. It should happen as part of the testing practice so they get used to it. I already kind of talked over the next bullet point is you should be using a variety of methods, multiple measures to inform your instructional practices and also to give marks. You should also show students what it's like to take a test. It should be quiet. There shouldn't be any interruptions. Things that make sense or are very obvious to teachers are not necessarily obvious to students. So you want to make sure that you're establishing that culture from beginning to end. We want to make sure that the exam is secure before, during, and after testing. Before testing, it should be in a centralized location. It's usually at the front office. If you have a testing office or testing coordinator, that person will normally secure the exams. When the exams are taken into the classrooms for testing, then they should be under lock and key when they are in the teacher's possession, given out at a certain time and collected during a certain time. And then after testing, according to the instructions of your testing coordinator, then they should be either turned into them or also kept under lock and key, and they also need to be accounted for. So you know that if you were assigned 50 tests, then you need to return 50 tests and that they're fully counted for. Like I already talked about, when in use, all paper materials must be secured where students, parents, or the public cannot gain access. Now they're starting to do testing online. Their student information, passwords, logins, things like that cannot be compromised either. That's one of the reasons they've moved to electronic tests or the online testing, because they really wanted to secure the materials. It's always been a nightmare securing the materials. Stuff always ends up just disappearing. So unethical practices would be things like allowing the students to use unauthorized resources to find answers. So if you have things like written on the wall, all those things should be coming down or they should be covered. If the students aren't able to use calculators, they shouldn't be supplied. If the students aren't able to use dictionaries or thesauruses, they shouldn't be applied. I don't know if they even use those anymore in schools. You need to make sure that if students need classification to provide special accommodations, then those classifications are done ahead of time, not afterwards to alter any subgroup reporting. If you are given a proctor and that proctor happens to be a parent, make sure that their student isn't in the room where they're proctoring. As you're supervising, as you're proctoring the exam, there shouldn't be a lot of communication between you and the student, but I have seen teachers walk around and point a particular question and shake their head no, or point a particular answer and tell them to erase this and answer that one. I mean, I've seen teachers blatantly do the last one, copying in whole or in part specific items appearing on the test. I've seen teachers grab a test, walk over to the copier in the front office, make a copy of the entire test, staple it, and then turn in the real test to the front office that's seen what they've done, and then walk off with a copy of the test because they want to be able to prepare their students next year. That's not okay. It's not okay before the test, certainly, but even after the test, those items are supposed to remain secure. They're not available for any other use except the test administration. In order to develop a culture of ethical practices and in terms of testing at your school, there's a few things that can be done. First, train everybody. If there's a certification for the use and administration of the testing materials, then try to get as many teachers as possible into that program. Making sure that you read and follow the manual consistently. Remember, all students should have equal access to the test for the allotted amount of time and the same amount of preparation as far as instructions on how to prepare for the test, or how to take the test, I should say. Prepare the room for testing, making sure that before the testing period starts, that anything that may not be considered appropriate is taken down or covered. The test should be administered according to the manual. So if the tests are supposed to be administered during a single session, that's the way it should happen. If there is a break during that single session for an emergency, then that would just be something that kind of happened and it's a non-issue. But if a teacher or a school decides, you know what, we're going to give this section of the exam, it's supposed to be 60 minutes, but we don't have 60 minutes. Let's just do 30 minutes and 30 minutes. That's not okay, because it's that those students are not getting the same access to the test as perhaps at another school where they're following the directions correctly. They're either at an advantage or disadvantage. Make sure that you read the testing directions as they are written. You just read them out. I'm sure you've had a test where you see the person at the front of the room just reading the instructions. Monitor as appropriate during testing. Make sure you're following instructions for test security and return the materials when you're supposed to. Also make sure that you return the correct amount of materials and you account for anything that might be missing. If you have any questions, somebody in the school should have been designated with that responsibility. There are different categories that describe the types of issues that might arise. The first one is just an administrative error, and this is something that was done with no intention of improving the scores. So for example, if the student was given the exam and the teacher read the instructions and the students were supposed to have 25 minutes to finish the exam, and the teacher forgot to set the timer and the students were accidentally given 20 minutes to finish the exam, or the timer didn't go off after 25 minutes, it went off after 40 minutes. It was just administrative error. Things happen. We're all human. Administrative errors happen. As long as the intention was not to improve the score, it can be administrative error. There are also ethical issues, and those are issues that were done in order to improve the scores, which ultimately will affect the validity. In that same example, if the teacher gave the students 40 minutes instead of 20 minutes, but it was just because they wanted to give them extra time, or if the students were supposed to have 40 minutes to take the test and the kids that finished could go out to recess and the kids that didn't had to stay in so they could have time to finish, that's not okay. That is also an ethical issue. Any situation where a teacher erases students' tests, like the bubble Scantron type of things, and then goes in and puts in the correct score, again, is an ethical issue. In fact, a lot of the programs that they use in order to correct these bubble Scantron type of scores are very sensitive to erasure marks. So when they see more erasure marks in one class versus erasure marks in other classes, then they think something might be happening in that particular class. Students' issues are anything that the student did to affect the validity. It could be cheating, but then it could also be refusal to take the test. Could be a kid just sitting there with their hands on their laps. They refuse to take the test. It could be kids making a design on their Scantron with the bubbles, drawing a cat or a skull and crossbones or whatever it is on the Scantron instead of answering the questions, or bubbling in all C. So anything that the student is doing to affect the validity is problematic. Finally, there can just be non-issues where something was believed to have happened, but it didn't actually occur, and whatever the problematic action was that caused the investigation, it was determined not to affect the validity. So if any of these things happen, what should you do? I know that within the DOE, there are whistleblower calls. If you go onto the DOE's website during testing, you'll see like there's a whistleblower 800 number. Keep in mind, 800 numbers can be traced. Think that you're calling, it's that anonymous. Any 800 number or 888 number can be traced back. You're expected to do complete disclosure. You should cooperate between the testing organization, whether it's PARC, whether it's the SAT, whether it's the regents and the school. You can also expect that there will be a thorough investigation. If the accusations are severe enough, you can expect to be called in several times, numerous times, by the party that's doing the investigation. If you're asked to retest, you should... Let's look at some examples. So here's one sample issue. The principal passes out the current year test booklets at a staff meeting for review prior to testing. Staff is told not to discuss the contents with students prior to the assessment. So, is this an inappropriate practice? And if so, is this an administrative error or is it unethical? 2, should it be reported? 3, how could this have been prevented? And 4, what is the solution? Well, yes, it's an unethical practice. It's inappropriate to do so. The information should be kept from the teachers until the day of the exam. Should it be reported? It should be reported, but I would caution you, just as a fellow teacher, be careful how you report it, because you don't want the repercussions of reporting to come back at you if the allegations are not taken seriously. I would question how ethical the administration at the school is, and if it were me, I would probably start to look for someplace else to go. How could this have been prevented? It could have been prevented by the principal just not doing it. It's very likely that they would have been told what the constraints are for the exams, and you as a teacher just kind of have no way but to sit there and listen to what the principal is doing. So I would say do what you need to do to keep your job for the end of the semester or the end of the year, but really think about how this is problematic and if you want to continue to be in that position at the school. Your best friend says he will lose his job if the PARC scores don't go up this year. After PARC testing is done for the day, you observe a staff member erasing and writing something on students' answer booklets. You also see a list of numbers with A, B, C's, and D's on it. Is this an inappropriate practice? Should it be reported? What other follow-up is needed? How could this have been prevented? And what is the solution? So is this an inappropriate practice? Oh yeah, it's definitely unethical. Should it be reported? And what other follow-up is needed? So in these situations, if this is a friend of yours and he's concerned about losing his job and you see him doing this, my first point of action would be to gently confront them and to encourage them to turn themselves in or to do something that's going to help them do the right thing. But again, you don't want to cause anything that is going to make them feel so much shame or so much fear that they could do something that would hurt themselves or others. As we saw in those examples, people take this really, really seriously. The shame of cheating when you're a teacher is huge. So you want to be really careful how you treat people in these situations. Ultimately, it does need to be reported. How could this have been prevented? The testing coordinator should have been on top of these kind of things. The teacher should not have been left alone with those exams for a very long time. And honestly, I feel like the best practice is at the end of every testing day, the school should go and pick up the tests, right? At the end of the testing period. That's how I would treat it. A student bubbles in answers for a test to create a design pattern on the answer folder. Is this an inappropriate practice? Should it be reported? How could this have been prevented, and what's the solution? Yes, this is a student error. The student didn't want to take the test, apparently. Should it be reported? It should be reported to the testing coordinator so that they know that that test is not valid. Should the student get in trouble? That's a decision between the school and probably the parent. Clearly, the kid doesn't want to test. If the kid doesn't want to test, why are we making them test? We're not going to get valid results anyways. How could this have been prevented? Perhaps a more favorable testing atmosphere would have been a great approach. What's the solution? I don't know. You can see if there's a possibility for a retest since there was student error. I don't know necessarily. But certainly the testing coordinator would have information about why that student's test should be invalid. Students were allowed to use inappropriate supplementary materials or not given access to supplementary materials were allowed. Is this an inappropriate practice? Should it be reported? How could this have been prevented? And what's the solution? It depends on the intent. This ultimately will affect the scores. Were they trying to improve the scores? Were they trying to invalidate the scores for some reason? That would be the difference, whether it was administrative error or an ethical. If the students weren't given access to the supplementary materials that they needed, a lot of times students might need like a little ruler or something like that. They might give them a ruler, or they might have a portion of the test where they're able to use a calculator and they weren't given access to that. They are not given the same opportunity as somebody that did have access to that. You'd need a little bit more information to determine if this was an administrative error or an ethical, because a student could have been given a calculator when the teacher thought it was fine. Should it be reported? It should be reported. I would encourage the teacher, again, themselves to report, and also coming up with sort of a way out, an escape route for teachers that make a bad decision and then want to come clean about it. How could this have been prevented? Really understanding what the expectations are for a particular subtest is important. So when you're taking like a battery of tests and all the different tests may have different instructions, it's important to know when something has a supplementary material and when something doesn't, and what the times are for all of those. So it's really important to know that stuff in the beginning. During PARCC testing, a classroom is found to have posters on the wall that list, describe, and give examples of core democratic values. Is this an inappropriate practice, administrative error, or unethical? Should it be reported? How could this have been prevented? Well, if the PARCC is testing on core democratic values, then it is an inappropriate practice. If the PARCC is testing on that and it was just a mistake, they forgot to cover it up, then it would be administrative error. If they left it open like that on purpose, then it's unethical. Should it be reported? Yes, it should be reported if the PARCC test has questions on core democratic values, or at least report to see so that somebody can check to make sure that there aren't any questions on the test where the answers might be somewhere in the room, or a clue or a hint maybe somewhere within the room where students can see that. How could this have been prevented? Again, depends on the situation. If the test is not testing core democratic values, what's there to prevent? There's nothing to prevent. If the test is, then perhaps somebody can go around. A lot of times a testing coordinator will go around and check the rooms to make sure that things are covered up as needed, and that would have prevented it from being either administrative error or unethical. Last one, a colleague tells you that they allowed some students to complete their ELA test the next morning or after a break. Is this inappropriate practice, administrative error, or unethical? Should it be reported? How could this have been prevented? This is unethical. They cannot do that. They should have known that would not be okay. This doesn't seem like it was a mistake. Should it be reported? It should be reported. Again, I always encourage the teacher to come clean first. It's always better to admit to something that you've done versus to have somebody squeal on you. Could this have been prevented? It could have been prevented. Why the testing coordinator allowed the teacher to keep the ELA test until the next morning is beyond me. I don't know how that could have happened. If it was after a break, that would be a little bit more understandable. But still, you really want to make sure that the students are given the right amount of time. The teacher should have known what the right amount of time is. In the Google Docs that I've linked down below, I have a couple more sample issues for you to kind of evaluate on your own. Sample issue 7 and sample issue 8. So you might want to give these a look and see if you can identify whether these are an administrative error, an ethical issue, a student issue, or a non-issue. You might wonder how testing companies are able to identify possible instances of cheating. There's different kinds. There's like a ratio analysis where you're looking at erasure marks versus correct answers and seeing if there's a correlation between the two. There's also looking for item response patterns analysis, all kinds of test score analysis. There's all kinds of statistical procedures they can use regardless of the statistical analysis that they use. It can only infer cheating. It's not proof of cheating. What would happen in that situation is they would send people down to do an investigation. If you ever saw the movie Stand and Deliver, it was a movie about the true story of a math teacher in East LA by the name of Jaime Escalante. Jaime Escalante was a math teacher that wanted to have his students pass the AP Calculus test so that they could receive college credit and go on to attend college. The school had performance issues. He was a great teacher. His students were very dedicated, and his students scored very well. Because of the students scoring so high, the College Board inferred that the students had cheated. And I have a link here that will actually take you to a clip of the movie where it has Edwards, James Olmos, and Andy Garcia kind of having it out about the students cheating or not cheating on the exam. It can kind of give you an idea of what the process is. If you ever are involved in an investigation for this, it's always good to have a clear record of the chain of custody and have the records ready. So if you are working with tests yourself, noting when you receive the test, noting how many tests were given to you, noting how many tests you returned and to whom you returned them is always important to have. So you might want to even just get in the practice of doing something like that. There won't be anybody from your particular site that will conduct the investigation. It should be people from another site, and they should actually be trained in investigative techniques for something like this. You are expected to fully cooperate and be transparent. They will conduct witness interviews individually and in a group, and there might be more than one interview per witness. If the school is found to have cheated, then there would be sanctions. It could be dismissal of staff, administration at the school. It could be losing some level of accreditation. It depends on what options are out there. So there's no one sanction that is always put in place. It just depends on the situation. It also depends on how egregious the cheating was. If you want information about testing in the DOE, here are a couple links. I fully encourage you that if you have standardized testing within your own classes, to go into the DOE and have a very clear idea of what the expectations are for testing within the district. Like I said, it's better to prepare and know what's happening now than have to deal with the repercussions later. Try to cultivate a culture of transparency and honesty at your school. And so that's the last lecture. I want to thank you for participating in the class. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me via my email or on Blackboard. Have a wonderful career. I wish you all the best.